Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Orbit Live event. I'm so excited to welcome two fantastic authors, Andy Marino and M.R. Carey. Andy Marino is the author of The Seven Visitations of Sydney Burgess, which just released today. The book is his debut novel for adults. He's previously written several books for young readers. M.R. Carey is the author of several books, including The Girl with All the Gifts and the Rampart trilogy, which began with the Book of Coley. Besides novels, Mike has also written a number of screenplays for radio, TV, and movies. Throughout the event, Andy and Mike will be answering your questions. You can submit any questions you have by clicking the Ask a Question link below the video. You can also vote on your fellow attendees' questions so that the questions with the most votes are likely answered first. This event is being recorded, and you will be able to access the replay using the same Crowdcast link you used to enter the event. And now, without further ado, I'll turn the event over to Andy and Mike.
Thanks, Angela, and happy launch day, Andy.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you, Angela, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. It's great to be here, and I really appreciate you all coming out virtually.
Do you want to start by telling us a little bit about Sydney Burgess?
Yeah, I will actually hold it up, even, because it is the launch day today. And I'm very excited. Like Angela said, it's my first horror novel, my first novel for adults after writing several books for middle grade readers, most recently historical adventures set in World War II, and then one coming out called Escape from Chernobyl in December. But Sydney Burgess is decidedly not for children. And it's the story of a woman, a former addict who has gotten her life together, gotten clean, to make a better life for herself and her son. She comes home one day to interrupt a home invasion in progress. She gets knocked unconscious, wakes up in the hospital, and the police tell her a story that's much different from how she remembers the event, namely that the intruder is dead in her house and has been savagely murdered, and her life kind of spirals out from there. She investigates what she can't remember while she's under all this cloud of suspicion, and her old addictive urges kind of come back to haunt her and manifest in a sort of cruel and tangible way. It's a horror tale, but it hangs from the bones of a modern thriller, and it explores, it touches on some horror touchstones, like some cosmic horror here and there, little drips and drabs of body horror, but yeah, it's all, again, tied together with this propulsive kind of thriller story.
It has a very unique monster at the heart, doesn't it? A sort of a presence, an evil presence, or certainly a malign presence that Sydney has a weird, unfathomable relationship with. But it depends very much on her point of view as well, doesn't it? We see things and experience things entirely from her perspective, which means that it stands or falls by her personality, and I think she's a really three-dimensional and compelling character. Do you want to talk about how you go about creating a character like Sydney?
Sure. Thank you for those kind words. In terms of the monster, just to touch on that really quickly, and this ties into the character as well, Sydney. There's kind of like, the unreliable narrator is a bit of a hoary old trope at this point, but I really wanted there to be an emerging monster tied into her addictions, and what I was really careful to do was to subvert this idea that she's this hysterical woman and it's all in her head or something like that. Like, this is a horror tale in the end, and I wanted the monster to be very real. I don't think that's too much of a spoiler. And so as it emerges, there's some psychological trickery at play with the character that ties into her past as an addict and as someone with a pretty fragmented sort of history. But I really wanted the monster to surface with its own dark desires and be a real thing that she had to deal with. I didn't just want it to be, all these things are in play in terms of motifs and, the metaphor for addiction and things like that. But I definitely didn't want it to be solely exist on that metaphorical level. So, but anyway, when it comes to creating a character like Sydney, it was in some ways there was like an easy kind of almost writing 101 thing to it, where she's this character who's really struggled and you can really root for her, and she's got very clear goals. And then there's this horrible obstacle in her way that she has to overcome. And then being first person POV just made so much sense because she can, it's a fully immersive experience, and you're right along for the struggle, for all of Sydney's struggles. And for whatever reason, that came really natural to me. I'm not exactly sure why.
Well, I mean, the other thing it achieves is it allows the monster to sort of hide in plain sight. If you think about sort of the way monsters function in classic horror movies, there's a sort of teasing before the reveal of the monster. And in the case of Sydney, because she doesn't know what it is, she doesn't know where it is, and she doesn't see it clearly for a large part of the novel, her perspective allows you to seed a lot of stuff in I think really sort of ingenious ways, so that the reveals when they do come feel sort of organic and feel like totally prepared, as though they've been there the whole time.
Yeah, thank you. That stems a lot from just how I have always consumed horror and the kind of horror I'm a fan of, where it's not necessarily a sense of ambiguity that I'm going for, but there's this kind of like atmosphere that's bred into everything, including character, that makes it feel as if everything's just a little bit off. So when, whether or not there's a monster emerging, it always feels like there's a monster there kind of lurking in the margins. And I really wanted the book to feel like that in this kind of like almost weird fiction tradition. But again, going back to the tangibility of the monster, I never wanted to rely on that sort of like what's now become almost a cop-out of like, is it or isn't there? Is it too crazy for us to comprehend? Like, I wanted there to be a monster. And I think those things that you point out, just they added to they helped me build suspense, but I didn't want to lean on them as kind of like the narrative hinging on them, if that makes any sense.
It does, yeah, it does for sure. And the other thing that struck me as really interesting about the novel, which I love, by the way,
Thank you.
is what you do with time. The sort of there are very, very sudden discontinuities. There are sudden jumps backwards and forwards. There are scenes that are set up, but then you don't immediately get the payoff. You move to something else, and then you fill in the gaps later on. Can you talk a little bit about that technique and why it's there, why you've used that?
Sure. That was actually one of my earliest readers and best friends is an accomplished screenwriter out in LA, and he read an early draft and had kind of steered me in the direction of that structure for the opening scene, where it's like the cop telling her about what happened, flashing back to what might have happened. And then for whatever reason, part of the reason is that I'm not a clockwork plotter by nature. I tend to just kind of like to flow and go where the story goes. But I needed to impose something rigorous on this because it had to adhere to some thriller conventions. And so I took his advice for the opening sequence, and I just sort of sat down and I applied it to everything. Like every section, every visitation has 6 chapters, 3 in one timeline, 3 in another, and that framework never breaks throughout the novel. Whether or not people realize it or not, I think it's the kind of thing that gets in your head and helps it become propulsive. So for me, it wasn't so much this like really innovative gimmick that I had in mind. It was almost a way to tether me to. It was almost like an exercise in boundaries as a writer, if that makes sense. It was like a selfish way to impose plot on myself, more than it was like and it made for some cool moments, but
impose plot structure on yourself
Yeah, it was a way to impose a structure and to give myself, because I tend to be, especially in early drafts, they tend to be formless. At least for me, I'm not much of an outliner, and so it was really helpful to think of it that way. It was a way I'd never written before, and it was just an interesting way to approach things, on just from a sort of selfish, let's make this work myself perspective.
I'm sort of the opposite in terms of planning. I think because I worked in comics for a long time before I started doing prose fiction, I got into the habit of like budgeting pages, because a comic narrative tends to be a very fixed template. You've only got so many pages to work in. So I'd sort of obsessively count up how many pages each scene would take, and sort of like work to a fairly rigid schema in that respect. Coming back to the monster for a second, there's a sense, isn't it, in which you're reinventing a classic formula. Is that something that you want to speak to, or a classic type of monster?
That's kind of you to say. I mean, in terms of like a possession narrative, yeah, there's no. It's a possession story that's not demonic in any way, and I guess is that maybe what you're driving at?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I just like when I started this book. I mean, everyone is either personally touched or knows someone who is touched by these sort of existential and visceral horrors of addiction. And for me, that was how I started, was just this cycle of relapse and addiction being its own kind of horrifying, circular journey, I guess. And so, maybe the metaphor, I'm sure the addiction metaphor has been done to death in other ways in terms of possession. But for me, it just presented a really interesting opportunity to give the monster desires and urges that mirrored just real world tragedies and problems in a way that wasn't just like, there's no scene where the heroes have to go to like the sub basement of the library and flip through the book and find the demon's true name and cast it out. And, it's not that kind of possession story. And so that was really interesting. And also I think what's cool is that a lot of times when things feel unique, it's because you fell backwards into them in some ways. Like while I was writing this, I didn't necessarily think of it really in the tradition of a classic possession story. And I think that really helps, it helps set the work apart a little bit. Like, it's not like I sat there with 10 possession novels and I read it and figured out how I would fit into this tradition or anything. It kind of like, it almost took other people to be like, you have a possession motif working here. And I think, I'd like to think anyway that helps set it apart.
The other thing that it does, I think, is it adds another dimension to the horror, because an awful lot of the discoveries that Sydney makes are about herself, aren't they? About her own past motivations, her own past actions. There's a sense in which part of the monster is already, it's an aspect of her that's kind of like become toxic or become dangerous to the life that she's trying to build for herself.
Yeah.
What was it like moving from YA into writing adult horror? Because it seems like in some ways a big jump, a marked jump.
Yeah, I mean, I want to apply this question to you because you work across such a broad, spectrum of things. But in a lot of ways, writing middle grade fiction, a lot of the lessons are the same, in terms of, at least for what I'm doing, and that, one of my main goals is just to write a propulsive narrative. And,
sure.
And when you're writing a book for 10 and 11-year-olds, like you have no choice but to make it propulsive. And so I may not be the world's best plotter or the most sort of crackerjack outliner, but I think in terms of scene work, and that kind of gut punch ending to a scene that pulls you into the next chapter, writing books for kids really helped develop that skill. There's not really much of a one-to-one correlation in terms of style. That was just like, obviously that had to be much more elevated for a book like this, but not elevated in the cerebral sense. Just it's a serious R-rated book for adults. So, but that's actually a good pivot point, because I want to jump back a little bit to what we were talking about before, when I started talking about how terrible I am at outlining, and you started talking about how you're kind of the opposite of that. And one of the things that strikes me about The Girl with All the Gifts is I've had this problem before in early drafts where I create too many characters, and some of them are really samey, and there's 10 characters doing what 5 characters could pull off. And one thing that really struck me about your book, and I realized that you didn't just write a first draft magically, but it's so tight, it's so impressive, And I was wondering, we've got our 5 core of characters. We've got Helen, Melanie, Sergeant Parks, Dr. Caldwell, and
Gallagher.
is that 5? And Galloway. You've got your 5 people that ended up going on the run from the institute, the lab. And right from the beginning there's other people that populate the lab, but those characters are set apart. Their conflicts are established, and they're almost on a journey together before they even leave. You feel like it's just so it feels so immersive right from the beginning in terms of who these characters are and why they're doing what they're doing, and the decisions that they make when they're in a structured environment. Then when the structure unravels, their decisions make so much sense and feel so organic. And I guess I wanted to ask you about developing, especially like say the first 50 pages of that book when they're all still in the institute and you're getting used to the world. Did those come easily, or were there other characters at play, or because there are other minor characters in there. There's Dr. Whitaker, the alcoholic teacher. And I wondered if there were characters that played bigger roles that you shrunk in the subsequent drafts.
No, and it kind of the weird thing about Girl with All the Gifts was that it was a short story before it was a novel and a movie. I wrote it for a themed anthology, edited by Charlene Harris and Tony Kellner. They used to do these anthologies every year, and the theme was always something really innocuous and everyday. Like one year it was home improvement, and another year it was family vacation, and this year it was school days. So write a horror or dark fantasy or supernatural story with the theme of school days or set in a school. And I said I'd do it, and then I spent ages trying to think of something that wasn't just a really bad Harry Potter ripoff. And eventually I just came up with the idea of Melanie, of this little girl sitting in a classroom writing an essay, the essay that everybody writes like 10 times during their school career, what I want to be when I grow up. Only we can see that she's undead, she's a zombie, and therefore growing up is probably not going to be an option for her. And that was kind of like the seed for it, just that reveal. And the short story only has 3 characters who matter. It's Melanie, Parks, and Justino, although Justino has a different name in the short story. And I really like the world, and I really like the character. Like the novel, what the short story does is it works in very, very simple declarative sentences. It's just ping, 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 to sort of kind of create the immediacy of the way a child sees a world. You know how when you're a kid, anything, no matter how tiny, can just like completely fill your whole mental horizon. So I was trying to get that across. And then once I'd written it, I felt there was more to the character and more to the world, and so I started to develop it into the novel. And every character, there was only one test really for each character, which is what do they tell us about Melanie? What does their relationship with Melanie do for our perceptions of that central character? It all revolved around her, and if they didn't work in that respect, it didn't matter what else they had going for them. But at the same time that I was working up the novel, I met this amazing independent producer, Camille Gatin, and we started working on a sci-fi movie together, and we lost the rights. We were halfway through the process. It was based on somebody else's novel, and the rights got stolen away. Well, stolen. Sorry, that's a terrible way to put it. They just got sold elsewhere from under our feet. And Cammy turned to me and said, "Well, what else do we have?" And I said, "We have this." I showed her the short story. So I was writing the novel and the short story together, and in a weird way, that kind of made the whole process a lot easier. And it probably is the most organic thing I've written, because I was sort of like working in that story space in so many different media at the same time. That's sort of partial answer.
Yeah, I wanted to pull one thing out of what you just said. You do. I mean, before we jump POVs, I think we stick with Melanie, our zombie kid, for the first 50 or 75 pages maybe, and it is extremely immersive, and it does feel exactly. There's no slippage in the POV. It's exactly what a little girl who doesn't quite understand her circumstances would be seeing, but we eventually jump POVs, and one of those points of view is Dr. Caldwell, who is the scientist. For people, I don't know how to really address this without spoiling things, but it's a 7-year-old book, so it's not on me. so there's Dr. Caldwell who's investigating this. They know even at this point, 20 or however many decades into the apocalypse here, that they know very little about the fungal infection and the spores that have led to humanity's, close to humanity's demise. So Dr. Caldwell is tasked with investigating this stuff, and we jump to her chapters, and then there's a pretty heady exploration of like, I'm not a scientist, but I'm going to call it fungal science.
Yeah.
And it's almost like it's almost jarring, jumping from not in a bad way, but just coming from this very kind of innocent and almost sweet and but sinister 10-year-old half zombie girl's perspective to Dr. Caldwell's cold and clinical dissection of like literal and figurative dissection of what's happening with the world. And I wanted to ask you, because there's such a novelistic creeping dread to the science in it, like they're finding things out, and it just expands the horror of what this actually means for humanity. And I wanted to just ask you about your research for that, or did you, when you were writing this, did you have placeholders like, science terms here, this is what this means, or did you make stuff up, or did you ground it in anything that could be a plausible fungal pathogen?
Well, the short story you just said, it's a virus. It's a viral infection, and I bluffed it. But when I came to write the novel and the screenplay, because in the expanded story, the search for a cure, Caldwell's search for a cure, is such an important plot thread. It is kind of like the motor that drives everything. I kind of felt like I needed to have something a bit more solid to go on that. So I literally went shopping for a pathogen when looking for an agent, some kind of infectious agent that might do the job. And I remembered seeing Secret Life of Plants, the David Attenborough documentary. And there's some footage there of Ophiocordyceps, this fungal infection, infecting an ant and like filling the ant's body to bursting point, and then the fruiting body of the fungus, which looks like a sort of like just this strange, weird phallic stalk bursting up out of the ant's head and then towering up above the ant's body in the jungle canopy. And it's more viscerally terrifying, I think, than a lot of things that are flat out horror. Not least because it really exists. This is a fungal parasite that hijacks your nervous system and turns you into a robot. It's like taking a car, stealing a car and driving it away. The ant just becomes a vehicle carrying the fungus and carrying out the fungus's desires. And the crazy thing is, it's not even unique. There are thousands of those organisms, those mind control organisms. Mostly they control insects and arthropods, so insects and arachnids. But there are some that can control mammals. The really scary example is toxoplasmosis, Toxoplasma gondii, which infects cats. But in order to get, its first host is a mouse, and in order to get from the mouse to the cat, it controls the mouse's instincts. It makes the mouse blind to risk. It makes the mouse behave in stupid and reckless ways. So mice normally run around the edges of rooms, so they've always got somewhere to hide. But a mouse with toxoplasma in its system will run across the center of a room. So there's more likely to get eaten by a cat. They're actually attracted by the scent of cat's urine. So the bacterium is making the mouse come into contact with the cat, so the cat will eat it, and the cat will get infected in its turn. And there is some evidence. There's I think a third of human beings have toxoplasma in their own system, and there's some evidence that if you have it, you calculate risk worse, less effectively. You're more likely to get run over by a car because you think it's going slower than it is, or it's further away. This is controversial. It hasn't been entirely proved, but there is a theory.
Yeah, I think I remember reading something that where like maybe people with like entrepreneurial spirit may have been infected with toxoplasmosis, right, more likely to take like business risks.
That's as with the sort of the addiction narrative in City Burgess. I think if you ground the kind of otherworldly horror in real world elements, I think it strengthens it. It makes it more plausible. It makes it more frightening, and it makes for a stronger emotional response from the reader, I think.
Yeah, and I think also one of the things that, I mean, again, they're not dissimilar in that when I was trying to ground the addiction narrative in this kind of reality, it was important for me to get at not only the reckless spirit that an addiction can engender, but also when she's looking back on it, there's this pull, and there's almost like this. It's not all dismal. I mean, it's dark in a lot of ways, but there's almost this sense of reckless joy that being an addict in some ways, you know, it's the lowering of inhibitions that, you know, drinkers are all familiar with and everything, but like to a exponential extent. And I think in your book too, there's this same sense where when Melanie first realizes how delicious it is to taste flesh and to let her senses be flooded with this, like, you know, it's essentially the first person, for people who haven't read it, or it's this first person POV of like a little zombie girl discovering the beautiful taste and smell of flesh, and it's like it's scary to her, but there's like a joy to it too that makes it feel so, it just makes it so well rounded and not just like zombie like flesh, you know. It's so much different than that.
It's a pleasure that's so intense that it kind of like it undermines your will, your ability to resist it. And in the same way, you know, for Sydney, that the possession becomes a kind of seduction at a certain point, doesn't it? It plays to those elements in her nature, and it gives her those satisfactions, which I think is in some ways is the most frightening thing about the story. That sense of a seduction, a sense of yourself, you're being attacked on that kind of fundamental level.
Yeah, I agree, and that even reminds me of another similarity, I guess, is that like it gives her, I mean, once the monster starts to kind of give her these, you know, it essentially gives her power that she wouldn't ordinarily have, and it's almost the same way with Melanie, where she becomes useful in a way that a normal human kid wouldn't, because of this terrible thing that's kind of growing inside of her, and so that just makes it makes this symbiosis really interesting, I think, and just less than, you know, better than your one note. There's a scary thing inside me.
I very much wanted that sort of that kind of reversal. The fact that when we first see Melanie, she is completely dependent on the adults around her, completely under their control, completely contingent. And then as soon as the base falls apart and they're out in the world, in the second half of the novel, the power relationships are reversed because she's the one who can survive out there.
Yes.
She's the one who has all the necessary skills. And particularly in her relationship with Parks, you see him sort of recognizing that, and his relationship with her changing as a result.
I noticed we're about the half-hour mark here. I wanted to ask you, though, I don't know how soon we want to start fielding questions, but I did want to get to, so your work in comics is really broad, and you've been a comic writer for decades. You've also wrote the screenplay of The Girl with All the Gifts in tandem with the book, or after the book was optioned, or okay. And so I guess I don't know if this is so much a process question. Maybe it's a process question, but maybe it harkens back to what you asked me about writing YA and then transitioning to horror. But you're kind of doing all the stuff at the same time in a lot of ways. And I wanted to know. I've never written comics, but I assume part of the outlining propensity comes from having to storyboard or present stories to artists and things like that. And does that carry over into novel writing for you?
It did, but in a good way, in a positive way. When I started out writing, the first thing I tried to do was write novels, and I was appalling at it. I was really, really bad at it. I wrote several novels in my teens and 20s, and they were just. It's kind to call them novels. They were just shapeless bags of story. I was terrible at planning, terrible at sort of imposing any kind of structure on the story. I just write a chapter, make a cup of tea, drink it, write another chapter, and then when I got close to something that felt like it was a bit endy, right at the end. With comics, because you only have a set number of pages, you kind of have to obsess about structure. You have to become a miser. Can I do this scene in 2 pages so that I can have a splash or a spread later in the issue. So it forces you to make decisions consciously about the shape of the story. And that was a really good discipline for me, because when I came out of comics around about 2005 and started to try novels, well, didn't come out of comics, I carried on writing comics, but trying to write novels alongside them, I used that kind of that skill set. I would do very, very full, ridiculously full chapter breakdowns. The plan for the first Castor novel was about 11,000 words long. It was a tenth of the length of the novel, which is kind of dumb. But it I think it was Mervyn Peake who said the beauty of having a really detailed plan is you can throw it away when you don't need it anymore. The plan is there as a kind of schema for you to fall back on. But if a better idea comes to you when you're writing, which it always does, then you can ignore it and you can go off piste and do your own thing, knowing that the plan is always there to rescue you again when you need it. So I've always been that kind of architect rather than gardener kind of writer, and it sounds like your instincts are completely different. That you kind of let the story take the shape it's going to take and then refine it afterwards.
Yeah, I just it's just how I've always kind of preferred to work. So I end up with which I'm going to steal your term. I end up with story bags, big,
right.
Like the game, like the old game Gauntlet, like the guys running around with like the bags. So I end up with story bags, and then I have to like eliminate whole bags and cut up the bags and let the pieces fall out and things like that. But what's interesting though is that I end up at this point in my career, having written a couple historical adventure novels for kids and things like that, is that it ends up being kind of a hybrid model.
Sure.
Mainly because my kids publisher is Scholastic, and they tend to want to see, it's a tight deadline. They want to see an outline. And like you said, I do end up, I have leeway to deviate from it, but I have to generally turn in some loose idea of what I'm going to be doing, which is not the way I prefer to work, but I understand, the reasons for it. So yeah, it ends up at this point just being kind of a hybrid. Where when I think probably when I first started writing story bags, I was just, totally anti-outline. This is inorganic, and I will just write until it's done. And then, you decide to be career oriented, and it doesn't really fly.
Yeah. And I guess I use a hybrid system now as well. Very often I'll sort of start writing a story, and then I'll switch to a plan. When I've got a sort of a general sense of where it's going, I'll pull out and I'll do some planning, and then I'll go back in again. So it becomes almost a fractal thing. You're planning the next act or the next few beats, and then when you run out of plan, you go back. We've got about half a dozen questions.
Yeah, maybe we should move into that. I agree.
We could move into that, couldn't you? Let's have a look. Will the events of the last year and a half influence your next story?
Good question. Let's take that. That's a good question. That's probably a really good question for you, Mike, as someone who's written about world-ending pathogens.
I actually, the weird thing is, I actually had a plague narrative in the second Rampart novel, the second book in the trilogy, and this was something that I'd written before lockdown started, before coronavirus started. But there's a whole thing about the village Mythenroot suddenly being afflicted by a thing called the Red Death, and then it came out like in the first few weeks of lockdown here, which was kind of crazy. It made me wish I hadn't gone there, because it was kind of like too pertinent to what was actually happening. I don't think I'll be writing any more plague narratives in the near future, but I think that the weird dislocations that lockdown brought, the sort of the kind of paranoia, that's definitely going to come into my stories in some form or other, I think.
Yeah.
How about you?
I think everyone's going to bump up against that. My answer is more, I think about it more in terms of, I have no interest in writing I don't really tend to work in post-apocalyptic or anything like that. And I don't have much of an interest in writing that kind of thing. But I have wondered, and I'm sure a lot of writers have wondered this too, like, is it going to be weird to write stories where people aren't putting on masks, or like if this is a part of our daily lives now, like, but then it's like, how often do you think about a character having to go to the bathroom, and do you need to write that in? And I think people are smart enough to know that if it exists in a slightly parallel world and there are no masks, like, it's not the biggest deal. But I could be wrong. I don't know.
There was a funny comment online. I think it was on Twitter. Somebody said, any zombie narrative in the future has to include a whole bunch of people running toward the zombies because they think it's all fake news.
Yeah. That's true. I mean, I think we're in for some heavy-handed political zombie stuff going. But yeah, good question.
There's a question here. Actually, there's a question just for me. Do you mind if I address this one?
Yeah.
Did you plan the whole?
Yeah.
Did you plan the whole Rampart trilogy before you started to write book one? Kind of, yes. What I did was what I often did in comics, which was I'd have a really, really strong sense of the first book, and then I'd have a really strong sense of the end of the last book. So I knew what I was triangulating towards. I knew what the sort of final beats would be, what the final disposition of all of the characters would be. But there was lots of stuff that happened along the way that wasn't planned or wasn't planned in detail. Because it's good to be open to the ideas that come in the middle of the process. So the beginning and the ending planned in detail, the rest sort of fairly fluid. Is that also something that you Andy, or no? Not really, I guess.
I haven't. Are you talking about trilogies?
No, just in terms of how you sort of like the shape of the story in your head when you sit down to write.
That's a really good question. I mean, like I said, it's story bags, so it's probably just a pile of things. I will say that one strange tangentially related thing. I don't know how you work in terms of notes, but as I write more and more, I write fewer and fewer things down while I'm doing. Like when I first started, I would have these massive codexes of notes and things like that, and I tend to hold a lot more in my head now. So I don't know what the shape is. It's I don't know why that's happening. Maybe just experience, but yeah, it's a strange thing.
There's a question here about influences, which is cool because I was going to ask you about that myself. When writing a first draft, do you seek out specific books or movies or stories to use as inspiration? Or do you prefer to avoid other material early in the process that might bump up against the genre or story arena that you're working in?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like I said when I sort of talked about this being a retroactive possession narrative, I don't tend to think about like, okay, I'm working in this genre now, I'd better become more well versed in it. I consider, I mean, most writers are, like, I'm a voracious enough reader and I've broad interests, so I think things are always kind of percolating and moving in from different angles. But I would say in terms of avoidance, I do tend to specifically avoid. Sometimes I just don't want to know like what other people are working on when I'm working on something in the same genre. Then I'll get freaked out, or I'll get in my own head about something, or because like I'm sure a lot of other writers do. Like, your reading time is limited, and a lot of times I tend to read the absolute master of something, or like I'm reading like one of the best whatever of all time, and I across this like breadth of my interests. And so that can really psych you out when you're writing. It's like it's I like to be immersed in all that stuff, but I also don't want to feel like the bar is so far up here and I'm comparing myself to generational talent or something like that, which we're all probably guilty of. So that's the second part of that question. And I think it's less seeking out specific things as it is just like continuing a constant sense of absorption from across. Like I personally, I mean, no disrespect to anyone who chooses this route, but like I feel like as a writer of horror and of horror thrillers, I would be doing a disservice to readers if that's all I read. I think the work would probably become flat. And I think for me, I'm much more interested in like weird narratives from sci-fi and fantasy and literary fiction and comics and everything. And I think that just makes for a better more diverse experience in reading and writing. So
Sure. I think it's definitely the case that writing within any genre, there's a conversation going on. There are constant reinventions, revisitings, re-examinations of classic tropes. So your possession story is in dialogue with other earlier possession stories. My zombie story depends on readers having sort of encountered other zombie stories and bringing some ideas with them into the story, which is cool. But I actually find that when I'm writing, when I'm sort of like in a ferment and I'm sort of like really hammering away, I don't read much at all, because the contamination I'm afraid of is not ideas, it's voice. I'm afraid that I'll be sort of like thrown off the frequency of what I'm writing if I read something that's like really strongly and indelibly in a different voice.
that's interesting. Do you still feel like that at this point in your career?
Yeah. I tend not to read when I'm writing. To be honest, these days I mostly read in bed, and I mostly read in very, very small segments, because I'll read a chapter and I'll fall asleep while I'm reading it, and the next night I'll read the same chapter again.
Yeah.
I've forgotten where I broke off.
You've been reading one chapter of a book for decades.
Pretty much, yeah. What else have we got here? There's one here with that's bespoke for both of us. Mike, what has been your favorite response or review to one of your books? And Andy, what has been your favorite reaction or review of your book so far? Okay, I want to talk here about one of my early novels. I wrote 5 novels that were sort of like supernatural crime thrillers, starring the exorcist Felix Castor. It was kind of like he's a noir detective recast as an exorcist. He's a guy who wears a long coat, walks the mean streets, etc. But it's set in the UK for the most part, and I went to America on tour when the first book was published in America, and I did an interview on Chicago Public Radio, and the guy tore me apart because my ballistics were so bad. He said, "What kind of a gun is this that you're writing? You got the guy sort of emptying the gun at this monstrous that's coming towards him until it goes click, and then before he can put a new clip of ammo in, then the monster tears him apart. And it wouldn't go click if it's an automatic, would it? I mean, the thing would lock, but it wouldn't click. Is it a revolver? Is it an automatic? What are you writing?" All I could say was, I'm from Britain. We don't really have guns here.
He was like trembling, waiting to ask you these questions. He couldn't wait to tear into it. It's really funny. I had a book blogger. It was almost an offhand comment, and I've since sort of talked about it a few times in Q&As and stuff. But and I should find her name because I failed to credit her a bunch of times. But she mentioned that one of the things she liked about the characterization of Sidney Burgess was that her addiction wasn't a quick character shorthand for a weakness. It was explored in all its, like I was saying before, it's reckless joy, it's horror, it's the tragedy of not being able to escape yourself. It's all these things, and I think I just really liked hearing that. Because that was one of the things I was going for, was like a really honest portrayal of that kind of life, and the idea that it would be shorthand for a weakness is just something that I would never want to. That's not territory I would want to mind. So I appreciated the reviewer picking that out.
I did a comic called The Unwritten for a long time, for 6 years, and there's a character in that called Tommy Taylor. Well, there's a character who's in a story within the story called Tommy Taylor, and he has a tattoo of a compass rose on the back of his hand. And there was a woman who's since become a good friend of mine on Twitter, who posted a tattoo that she got.
Like I lost the audio. I don't know if anybody else did.
Oh, okay. There's a woman who actually got the compass rose tattoo from the comic tattooed on her own arm, and also one of the characters from the comic on her other arm. I thought that was a really cool thing, that someone liked the story enough to kind of like incorporate it into themselves in that way.
That is, yeah, that's the dream. That's really cool. All right,
What else have we got here? With storytelling available in an unprecedented number of formats and channels, is the age of the specialist writer over? What do you think?
Wow, that's a great question.
It's a profound question.
I don't know if I can credibly field a question about an age being over, but I think, I mean, in terms of having a career, it definitely behooves people to write. I mean, Mike can probably answer this better than I can, but there are so many opportunities for writing everything, and to say that like I'm just a novelist or something like that is limiting more than it's. I mean, I respect that if people only want to do one thing, but I think to be willing to write across different media is probably really beneficial.
But I think all creative industries are mutating and developing all the time, and therefore the careers of writers are things that are mutating all the time. I've never felt like I had any kind of sense of direction, like I knew where I was going. I would try to write something if it was interesting to me. There is an awful lot of interconnectedness these days. If you're writing in one field, it's quite common to be invited to write in another field. Comics publishers look for people who are published in prose fiction. Games writers, games companies look for writers who've done comics or have done screenwriting, because there's so much overlap in the skill sets. I think it's a dynamic situation. It depends what you mean by specialist, though. I mean, I do think I'm sort of a specialist in terms of, or at least I have a narrow repertoire in terms of genre. I can only write speculative fiction. I can write horror, fantasy, sci-fi, magic realism. I can't do anything else. If I try to write naturalistic or so-called literary fiction, it just falls apart under me. It's like trying to paint in black and white when you've been painting in color. I just have no interest in, and therefore no ability to do that.
You might be the world's foremost Lucifer specialist.
Yeah.
For those people who don't know, Mike wrote the Lucifer comics for 7 years, beginning to end. I think your run is yours the only run of Lucifer?
Well, it's been there've been two further iterations since. One of them my Holy Black, and then one even more recently than that. So it has been brought back. But yeah, I did the whole of the initial, the initial run, which was 75 issues, and that was my first ever monthly book, which was wonderful, because I was a huge Sandman fan, and so the chance to write what was effectively a kind of I was going to say a sequel to Sandman, but a story set in the Sandman universe that enabled me to sort of have full access to those characters was amazing. And Neil Gaiman was an amazingly generous collaborator, in that basically he just said, "Yeah, help yourself. If you ever sort of like grab hold of something that I want to keep, I'll tell you.
Right.
Otherwise, do what you like." And the only time he ever told me no was when I wanted to use Rose Walker and Rose Walker's pregnancy in a story, and he said, "No, I might come back and finish that story myself someday."
That's funny. Did you send him? Did you have to send him like storyboards, or before every?
He was a consultant at that point. He was a consultant on everything in the Sandman universe that DC were bringing out.
Yeah.
So he got to read the plans. He got to read the script, and we would talk. We would talk on the phone, and I'd bounce ideas off him. And he was, considering how much else he must have had going on at the time, he was just unbelievably kind and generous with his time. So that was a wonderful experience. He also told me the only way to sort of to learn what a weird mix of planning and serendipity a monthly comic book is to do it. You have to discover it from the inside. Great. Which turned out to be true.
Yeah. I think based on these questions, Orbit might want us to wrap up with questions labeled to wrap up.
Okay, so what else have we got? There's a question about fungi here. Is fungus the new theory about the impending zombie apocalypse? I ask because it's not the first mention of it in a speculative fiction story. I wonder if that question is about The Last of Us, because The Last of Us used not just a fungus, but the same fungus that I use, Ophiocordyceps unilateralis. We both sort of grabbed hold of it at the same time. I think the game came out a little bit before the novel did, but I submitted the novel a long time before the game released, so there was no influence one way or the other. I was just pissed off that they got it out into the world first. I still never played that game.
That's funny. It reminds me of I guess it's not quite the same thing, but I always think of William Gibson going to see Blade Runner while he was working on Neuromancer and being like, oh shit.
Yes, I can see that.
Yeah.
What else have we got? What are stories? In any stories in any medium that are scary to us? So recommends. Go on, you go first.
Sure. I tend to find I like all brands of horror, but I tend to find things that really get under your skin to be like, off kilter descriptions of the mundane and things like that, and just kind of left of center creepiness more so than kind of overt scares. And so I always like to recommend a writer named Brian Evanston, who wrote a short story collection called The Collapse of Horses. And it's probably falls under the weird fiction umbrella, but they're just so unsettling. And if I were to describe them to you, they might not sound scary. It's kind of one of those things. But I just find that I think about them all the time. It's about like turns of phrases and just these unreplicatable feelings to me that are so scary. And I try to work with that in my own writing as well.
Right. In terms of movies, I love The Shining. I love the original movie of The Shining. I love the Doctor Sleep that came out this year. I thought both of those were magnificent. I thought that the Mike Flanagan Haunting of Hill House was very, very frightening and beautifully made. There's a novel by John Langdon called The Fisherman, which is one of my favourite horror novels of recent years, which is just indescribable. It's a little bit sort of cosmic horror inflected. It's about a little inlet of a river somewhere in the United States where...
In the Hudson Valley, actually, near me.
Okay, fair enough. Where supernatural things can happen, including people coming back from the dead. It's a beautiful work and just overwhelmingly terrifying, I thought.
Yeah, I second that. I love that book.
To wrap up, what are you working on? Is this the last one, or have I missed one?
Two more.
Okay, go on. I'm not seeing them, so.
What are you saying? What are you working on next? If you can talk about it.
Yeah. Okay. So I've just finished a novel. I just handed in a novel. Handed in the first draft of a novel, which is kind of you'd have to call it the Magnificent Seven if the Magnificent Seven were undead. It's sort of like a medieval version of that story where the champions who are dredged together are monsters of one sort or another. There's a couple of ghosts, there's a witch, there's a revenant, there's a bogeyman, there's a water elemental, and they're trying to save a bunch of villagers from an impending threat. That was crazy fun to write. It's actually set in the early 12th century in the UK. It's a time called the Anarchy, when the Empress Matilda was trying to take over the throne of Britain, and there was a period of like 40 years when effectively all the laws of the land were suspended and everything was just appalling blood-bolted chaos. So a good backdrop for the story.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I also just turned in the first draft of the second horror novel to Orbit, and it is about a sculptor whose sister gets kidnapped, and as part of the ransom to pay her back, he's sort of given this 17th century codex and forced to sculpt this infernal, impossible, horrible sculpture that involves organic things and other things. But anyway, he's forced to put this horrible sculpture together if he wants to ever see his sister alive again, is the point.
Cool, very cool. So do you think that, will you be running the sort of YA fiction and the adult horror side by side in the future? You plan to carry on with both?
Yeah, as of right now, there's kind of a tandem thing going. I have a new middle grade novel with Scholastic coming out in the winter called Escape from Chernobyl, about escaping from Chernobyl, and so it looks like I'll be writing more in that kind of vein of these like historical. I wrote a World War II trilogy as well for Scholastic with kids, so it seems like that's kind of the niche I've carved out for that, and I'm hoping to run that kind of neck and neck with horror novels for adults. So,
do they scratch different itches for you?
Yeah,
they provide different satisfaction, different pleasures.
Yeah, I like there's a research element to these historicals for kids that's not necessarily present in horror novels set in the present day, which are just kind of come out. So yeah, it tends to be a totally different process, and those novels are also short, so there's something satisfying about writing 45,000 words and calling it a day.
Yeah, I can totally see that.
Yeah.
Yeah, not quite run out of time, but we have run out of questions.
56 minutes is good.
Yeah, we could just wrap up there, couldn't we? Unless anyone has another question they want to throw in. It still says that there's a question extra.
Oh yeah, wait, let me see if I can see it. Wait, are you not? It says, what's something you've read, watched, or listened to lately that you loved?
Oh yes, okay. There's a movie that I saw on either Prime or Netflix called Dark Song. It might have been on Amazon Prime. Dark Song. It had Steve Oram in, the guy from Sightseers. And it's about a woman who's lost her child, and she contacts this kind of like magic expert, this occultist, and she says, I need you to help me do a spell. I need to perform a spell. And we don't find out what the spell is. We know it's something to do with the dead child. And maybe we sort of like reach certain conclusions of our own. And he allows himself to be persuaded. He says, if we're going to do this, you just have to give yourself into my hands for as long as it takes. We lock ourselves in this house. We do a line of salt around the house. Nobody comes in. Nobody goes out. You're completely under my control for that time. And she says, yes, let's do it. And the whole thing takes place in the house. The whole thing is to do with the preparation for the ritual, the performance of the spell, and the consequences. And it's absolutely dynamite. It's just a two-hander. Just beautifully judged and really, really compelling.
That's awesome. What did you say it was called?
A Dark Song.
Nice. I will. I'll get extra points by giving an Orbit book a plug. But I just read the sci-fi writer Alistair Reynolds, who's written a bunch of like huge space opera type stories. But he has some standalones too. And I just read one called House of Suns, which spans like millions of years across the galaxy and is really pretty mind blowing. So, House of Suns.
His Ministry to the Future is also absolutely amazing, which is his novel about climate breakdown.
Oh, cool! Yeah, his stuff. I like come back to it sporadically over the years, and I'm always pretty blown away. I see Orbit has placed the title.
I'm missing that.
The helpful link for everyone.
Cool. I think we should probably say goodbye because we're almost up on the hour.
Yeah.
It's been great talking, Andy. And everyone check out 7 Visitations of Sydney Burgess. Buy it on its release day. Because then you can say you did.
Yeah. Check out Girl with All the Gifts book and movie and the Rampart trilogy and Mike's hundreds probably of comic book titles, if not thousands. Anyway, great talking to you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Yep. Cheers, guys.